My stepmom smiled at me in front of the entire family and said, "Remember, you're just a guest here." After I spent the whole day cooking, setting up the party, and paying for half the event, I didn't argue. I just quietly took back everything I had been paying for: the Wi-Fi, the power, the insurance, even the air conditioning. 2 days later, my stepmom was screaming because the house was falling apart and the bills were piling up. And suddenly the guest was the only person who had been holding their life together. Family loyalty was something I believed in for most of my life, almost like it was a rule written somewhere that everyone silently agreed to follow. Growing up in Columbus, Ohio, I always thought that no matter what happened, family was supposed to stay together, support each other, and show up when it mattered. I held on to that idea harder than most people probably would have, mostly because everything in my life started falling apart when I was 16. That was the year my mother died. One day, she was there making dinner and asking me about school, and then suddenly she was gone, and the entire house felt like it had been emptied of warmth overnight. My father didn't know how to handle it, and honestly, neither did I, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart the way he did. My younger brother Ethan was only 9 at the time, and from the moment our mom passed away, I felt like it was my responsibility to make sure he was okay. I started doing things that most 16-year-olds didn't have to think about. I learned how to cook real meals instead of just heating up frozen food. I helped Ethan with his homework every night because my dad was either working late or sitting silently in the living room staring at the television without really watching it. I made sure Ethan got to school on time, that he had clean clothes, and that someone was there to listen when he was scared or confused. I didn't complain because I believed that was what family did for each other. Less than a year after my mom died, my father remarried. It happened so quickly that it almost felt unreal, like I had missed some important conversation that everyone else had been part of. Her name was Melissa Carter, and when she moved into the house, everything changed in a way I could never fully explain. She wasn't openly cruel or hostile toward me. In fact, she was always polite, always calm, always speaking with that careful tone people use when they want to appear reasonable. But there was a distance in the way she treated me that made it clear I didn't quite belong anymore. It was subtle at first, small things that could easily be ignored if you wanted to pretend everything was fine. The house itself started to feel different. The decorations changed, the routines shifted, and slowly I started to feel like I was a guest living in someone else's home rather than a son living in his own. My father, who used to talk to me about everything from school to sports to random things happening in the neighborhood, began pulling away. At first, I told myself it was because he was grieving and trying to rebuild his life. Then I thought maybe he was just adjusting to being married again. But as time went on, the conversations between us became shorter and less frequent, until most days we barely spoke at all. Despite all of that, I kept trying. I believed that if I worked hard enough and showed them that I cared about the family, things would eventually feel normal again. When I started college, I stayed in Columbus instead of moving away because I didn't want Ethan to feel abandoned. I worked part-time jobs between classes, sometimes juggling 2 at once, and a lot of that money ended up going toward groceries or helping with household bills. No one ever directly asked me to do it, but the need was obvious, and I thought contributing would make me feel like I still had a place in that house. Most nights, I would come home exhausted from work, but I still helped Ethan study or drove him to places he needed to go. He looked up to me in a way that made the responsibility feel worth it. I wanted him to grow up feeling supported, even if our father had slowly started drifting away emotionally. Melissa watched all of this from a distance, always composed, always polite, but never really warm. She thanked me occasionally, but the gratitude always felt formal, like something you would say to a neighbor rather than a family member. When I turned 21, I finally moved into my own small apartment across town. It wasn't anything impressive, just a modest place with thin walls and furniture that mostly came from secondhand stores, but it was mine. Even then, I never considered cutting contact with my family. The idea didn't even cross my mind. Instead, I doubled down on my effort to stay connected. Every Sunday, I called my dad to check in. Sometimes the conversations were short and awkward, but I kept doing it anyway. I showed up for every holiday gathering, bringing small gifts even when money was tight. I made sure Ethan knew he could call me whenever he needed something. A part of me believed that consistency would eventually prove something to them. I thought that if I kept showing up, kept helping, kept acting like family, even when it didn't always feel mutual, eventually they would recognize the effort. I imagined that one day my father would sit down with me and say he appreciated everything I had done. I thought Melissa might start treating me less like an outsider and more like a son. I convinced myself that loyalty had to mean something in the long run. So I kept showing up year after year, holding on to the belief that family loyalty was real and that if I gave enough of it, eventually it would come back to me. At the time, I had no idea that the people I was trying the hardest for were already starting to see me very differently than I saw them. 10 years passed faster than I expected, and somewhere during that time, the small routines I had built around staying connected to my family became something automatic, something I didn't even question anymore. I kept calling on Sundays, kept showing up for holidays, kept telling myself that consistency mattered even if the conversation stayed short and the emotional distance never really disappeared. By the time I turned 31, our interactions had settled into a strange kind of balance where I was always present but never fully included. That was the situation when Melissa announced what she called the biggest Easter celebration our family had ever hosted. She talked about it weeks in advance like it was some kind of major social event. According to her, the house in Dublin, Ohio, was going to be full of extended relatives, neighbors, and family friends. She described a huge backyard egg hunt for the kids, professionally catered food, decorations everywhere, and long outdoor tables set up for what she called a perfect spring gathering. The way she described everything made it sound less like a simple holiday and more like a carefully planned production. When the invitation first reached me, I honestly considered skipping it entirely. Over the years, I had started to realize that showing up to these gatherings usually meant spending most of my time on the edges of the room, while everyone else interacted naturally. The only reason I changed my mind was Ethan. He called me personally a few days before Easter, and his tone carried that familiar mix of excitement and expectation that he had when we were younger. He told me it would mean a lot if I came early because there would be so many people there, and it would be good to see me. Hearing that was enough to make me feel obligated in the way older brothers often do, so I told him I would be there in the morning to help if they needed anything. When I arrived at the house early on Easter morning, the place already looked like it was preparing for a large event. Decorations were hanging along the fence, plastic eggs were stacked in boxes on the patio, and folding tables were leaning against the garage, waiting to be arranged in the backyard. Melissa greeted me at the door with the same polite smile she had always used around me. But there was no small talk, no moment of welcoming conversation. Almost immediately, she began speaking in that efficient, organized tone that sounded less like someone talking to family and more like a manager giving instructions to an employee who had just arrived for a shift. Within a few minutes, she had already listed a long series of things that needed to be done before the guest arrived. She told me the backyard needed to be cleaned up because the wind had blown branches and leaves across the grass. She wanted the plastic eggs filled with candy and hidden around the yard in preparation for the egg hunt. She pointed to the folding tables and explained where they needed to be set up and covered with tablecloths. There were coolers that had to be filled with ice and drinks, chairs that needed to be checked because some of them were slightly broken, and decorations that had to be adjusted so everything looked symmetrical. The entire list kept growing as she walked around the yard, pointing at different things that required attention. I spent the next several hours moving constantly from one task to another without really stopping. I cleaned the backyard, gathering branches and bags of leaves until my hands were dirty and my shirt was already showing streaks of grass and dust. I filled dozens of plastic eggs with candy and hid them throughout the yard while trying to follow Melissa's instructions about making sure younger kids could still find some of them easily. I unfolded tables, carried them across the patio, and arranged them in long rows while balancing chairs on my shoulders and checking which ones needed quick repairs. At one point, I found myself kneeling on the ground, tightening loose screws in a chair leg, while listening to Melissa give instructions to someone else about flower arrangements. Just when it seemed like everything was finally under control, the catering company arrived, and Melissa discovered that one of the special dishes she had ordered for a vegetarian guest was missing. I watched her expression tighten in frustration before she turned toward me almost automatically and told me the nearest grocery store was only a few minutes away. She handed me a short list of ingredients that could substitute for the missing dish and said it would be great if I could run over there quickly so the guest wouldn't feel overlooked. Without really thinking about it, I grabbed my keys and drove to the store. The place was crowded with people doing last-minute holiday shopping, which meant the quick trip took longer than expected. I walked through the aisles, collecting everything on the list, tried to find ingredients that matched what she had described, and when I reached the register, the total came out to $212. I paid for it without hesitation, assuming someone would reimburse me later once things settled down. By the time I returned to the house, the driveway was already filling with cars as relatives and friends began arriving for the celebration. I carried the grocery bags inside and delivered them to the kitchen before heading back outside to finish the last few tasks Melissa had mentioned earlier. At that point, I finally noticed how different I looked compared to everyone else who was starting to gather in the backyard. My shirt was wrinkled and stained from yard work. My hands were still slightly dirty, and my hair was probably a mess from hours of moving tables and hauling equipment around. Meanwhile, everyone else looked relaxed and ready to celebrate the holiday. People were wearing clean spring outfits, greeting each other with smiles, holding drinks while chatting near the patio. A few relatives glanced at me briefly while I carried another stack of chairs across the grass, and I noticed something strange in the way they looked at me. One older cousin even nodded politely and asked if I could point him toward Melissa because he wanted to compliment her on the setup. The way he spoke made it clear he assumed I was someone hired to help with the event rather than a member of the family hosting it. That moment stayed with me longer than I expected, because for the first time I realized that to some of the people arriving that day, I didn't look like a son or a brother at all. I looked like staff. As the afternoon continued, more and more people filled the backyard until the quiet morning setup I had worked on slowly transformed into a full gathering of voices, laughter, and constant movement. Melissa's relatives began arriving in small groups, greeting each other loudly as if they hadn't seen one another in years, even though many of them probably had met only weeks earlier. Neighbors from down the street walked through the gate, carrying dishes and bottles of wine, complimenting the decorations and the neatly arranged tables that I had spent hours setting up. From a distance, the whole scene probably looked like a perfect suburban holiday celebration, the kind of gathering people imagine when they think about family traditions and comfortable homes filled with warmth. Standing there in the middle of it, I felt strangely separate from everything around me. At first, I kept myself busy moving small things around the yard, adjusting chairs, straightening decorations, and helping a few of the younger kids find the plastic eggs I had hidden earlier. It gave me something to do with my hands and made it easier to avoid the awkward feeling of not really belonging anywhere in the crowd. Eventually, I grabbed a plastic cup of lemonade from the drink cooler and stepped toward the long tables that had been set up for dinner later in the afternoon. One by one, people started sitting down in groups, claiming seats while they talked and laughed with each other. That was when I noticed something that at first seemed like a simple oversight. No one had saved me a seat. The tables were long enough to hold dozens of people, and at the beginning there were still empty chairs scattered along the sides. I assumed that once everyone settled and someone would naturally shift around and make room. I stood near the edge of the tables holding my cup, listening to conversations drift past me as relatives shared stories and neighbors introduced themselves to one another. Every few minutes another chair filled as someone pulled it out and sat down. I waited calmly, telling myself that eventually someone would glance up, notice me standing there, and gesture toward an open spot. Ethan approached me briefly at one point, smiling quickly in that distracted way people do when their attention is already somewhere else. He greeted me, said something about how great the setup looked, and mentioned that his girlfriend had just arrived. Before I could respond with more than a few words, he had already turned and disappeared into the crowd again, following her toward a group of people near the fence. I watched them join a circle of conversation while I remained standing near the tables, still holding the same cup of lemonade that was starting to warm in my hand. As the minutes passed, the last of the empty chairs slowly disappeared. Families grouped together, couples sat side by side, Children squeezed between parents while older relatives claimed comfortable positions near the center of the table. I kept telling myself it had to be accidental. With this many people, it was easy for small details to slip through the cracks. I assumed that someone would eventually realize the seating arrangement had left me standing alone and would fix it without hesitation. Instead, people continued walking past me, as if I were simply part of the environment. Some guests moved around me while carrying plates or drinks without even acknowledging that I was there. A few relatives gave polite nods the way people sometimes greet a stranger who happens to be nearby. The strange part was that I had known many of these people for years, but the way they glanced at me now carried the same distant politeness you might show to someone hired to work an event. The longer it continued, the more invisible I began to feel. I stood close enough to hear conversations about vacations, jobs, and neighborhood gossip, yet no one invited me to join them. My role seemed to exist somewhere between guest and staff, an undefined presence hovering near the edges of the gathering. Eventually, Melissa announced that dinner was ready and asked everyone to line up near the serving table that had been arranged along the patio. That table was something I'd spent a long time organizing earlier in the day, carefully placing trays, utensils, and decorations so everything would look presentable when the food arrived. Out of habit more than anything else, I stepped forward to straighten a few serving spoons and adjust one of the trays that had been moved slightly out of place. I wasn't trying to control anything or interfere with the event. It was simply the natural instinct of someone who had spent hours preparing the setup and wanted things to stay orderly. As I reached across the table to shift a platter slightly closer to the center, I heard my father's voice cut through the noise of the gathering. Richard Whitaker didn't raise his voice dramatically, but he spoke loudly enough that several people nearby stopped talking and glanced in our direction. What struck me immediately was that he didn't even look at me while he said it. His attention remained on the crowd in front of him, as if he were making a general statement rather than addressing his own son. Remember, you're just a guest here now. Don't start acting like you run things. The sentence landed with a sharpness that caught me completely off guard. For a moment, the surrounding conversations seemed to fade into a dull background hum while I processed what he had just said. I stood there with my hands still resting on the edge of the serving table, unsure how to react to a comment that had been delivered so casually in front of everyone. Before I could even gather my thoughts, Melissa added her own remark from a few steps away. She didn't raise her voice much either, but there was a clear smirk on her face as she spoke. Logan just needs to remember his place. Those words hit harder than I expected, not because they were shouted or dramatic, but because of how calmly they were delivered, as if the statement was obvious and didn't require any explanation. I felt a sudden tightness in my chest that made it difficult to breathe normally for a few seconds. Instinctively, I turned my head toward Ethan. Part of me hoped he would step forward, laugh it off, or say something that would soften the moment and remind everyone that I was still part of the family, standing there in the yard. Instead, he avoided looking at me entirely. His gaze dropped briefly toward the ground before he turned his attention back to the group around him, remaining silent as if nothing unusual had happened at all. In that moment, the noise of the party returned around me, conversations continuing and plates clattering together as people moved toward the food, while I stood there realizing that no one intended to challenge what had just been said. For a few seconds after those words were said, I simply stood there beside the serving table while people began lining up for food as if nothing unusual had happened. Plates were being picked up, utensils clinked against metal trays, and conversations resumed almost immediately. The moment that had just landed on me like a punch barely created a ripple in the crowd. I felt a strange stillness settle inside my chest. Not anger exactly, not sadness either, but something heavier that felt like the quiet realization of a truth I'd spent years avoiding. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain anything to anyone standing there. Instead, I stepped back from the table, placed the serving spoon down exactly where it had been, and turned toward the house without saying a single word. No one stopped me, and most people didn't even notice I was leaving the center of the gathering. From the outside, it probably looked like I was just going inside to grab something quickly. The moment I walked through the back door, The sound of the party outside became slightly muffled, replaced by the quieter stillness of the kitchen and hallway. The bag I had brought earlier in the day was still sitting near the front door, where I had left it when I arrived that morning. I picked it up slowly, not because I needed anything inside it, but because the motion helped steady my hands while my thoughts were settling into place. For years, I had been the person who quietly fixed things in that house without anyone really thinking about it. If something broke, I found a way to repair it. If something was missing, I usually replaced it. I never kept track of those things in any official way because I believed I was helping my family, and helping family wasn't supposed to be transactional. But as I stood there in the quiet hallway, one thought kept repeating in my mind with uncomfortable clarity. If I was truly just a guest, then the things I had brought into that house were no longer something I needed to leave behind. The first thing I walked toward was the small office room near the living area. Months earlier, the internet in the house had been constantly failing, dropping connections, and frustrating everyone who relied on it. Instead of watching them struggle with the issue, I had bought a high-quality Wi-Fi router with my own money and installed it myself. I stepped over to the desk, where it sat blinking quietly beside the modem. Without hesitation, I reached down, unplugged the cables, and wrapped them neatly around the device before placing it inside my bag. The action felt strangely calm, almost methodical, as if I were simply finishing a task that had been waiting for me. From there, I moved toward the sliding door that led back to the patio. Outside, I could still hear the sound of voices and laughter drifting across the yard. Near the corner of the patio stood the large outdoor speakers I had lent to the family months earlier for Ethan's graduation party. At the time, I had set them up so music could play throughout the backyard, and afterward, no one had ever asked when I might want them returned. I walked outside again, carrying my bag, passing several guests who glanced at me curiously as I approached the speakers. Without explaining anything, I crouched down and unplugged the cables connecting them to the small audio system on the patio table. One by one, I lifted the speakers, feeling their familiar weight in my hands, and carried them toward the driveway. A few people paused their conversations to watch me move across the yard with the equipment, their expressions filled with quiet confusion, as if they were trying to understand why someone would start dismantling part of the setup during a party. I opened the trunk of my car and carefully placed the speakers inside before walking back toward the house again. Each step felt steady and deliberate, like the slow closing of a door that had been left open far too long. Inside the garage was another item I had completely forgotten about until that moment. During a brutal winter storm the previous year, the power in the neighborhood had gone out for nearly 2 days. I had purchased a portable generator and brought it over so the house wouldn't be left without electricity or heat. After the storm passed, I never bothered taking it back because everyone said it might be useful to keep there just in case something similar happened again. The generator was still sitting exactly where I had left it. I rolled it toward the driveway, the small wheels rattling softly against the concrete floor. As I guided it toward my car, several guests near the front yard turned to look, clearly puzzled by what they were seeing. Some of them whispered to each other while watching me load the equipment into the trunk beside the speakers. Through all of it, I felt surprisingly calm. There was no dramatic surge of emotion, no urge to argue with anyone or explain my reasoning. Something inside me had simply shifted into a different position, like a lock finally clicking into place after years of resistance. For most of my life, I had been the quiet problem solver in that family. I handled things without being asked, fixed issues before they became visible, and stepped in whenever help was needed. I never expected applause or recognition because I believed that was just what loyalty looked like. But standing there beside my car with the trunk open, I realized how completely that role had defined the way people saw me. Being publicly labeled a guest had done something none of the smaller moments over the years had managed to do. It erased the last illusion that I still belonged to that household in any meaningful way. If my father truly believed I was just another guest standing in his yard, then the responsibilities I had quietly carried for so long were no longer mine. I lifted the final piece of equipment into the trunk and closed it slowly, the sound echoing lightly through the driveway. In that moment, the realization settled fully in my mind with a clarity that felt both painful and strangely freeing. If I was nothing more than a guest in that house, then I no longer had any reason to keep supporting it. After I closed the trunk of my car, I didn't start the engine right away. The driveway was still filled with vehicles belonging to relatives and neighbors, and through the open gate, I could hear the distant sound of conversation and laughter continuing in the backyard, as if nothing significant had changed. I slid into the driver's seat and shut the door, and the moment the car sealed off the outside, everything became strangely quiet. For the first time that entire day, I allowed myself to sit still. My hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment while my mind replayed the words that had been said earlier near the serving table. "You're just a guest here now." The sentence echoed with a clarity that made everything else fall into place. I realized that if I truly accepted that statement, then there were a lot of things tied to that household that no longer made sense for me to carry. I reached into the center console and pulled out my phone, unlocking it with the kind of slow focus people use when they're about to deal with something they have been putting off for a long time. On the screen, there was a folder I had created years earlier called Shared Expenses. It wasn't something dramatic or secretive. It was simply a place where I kept records of payments and accounts connected to my family, mostly so I wouldn't forget dates or lose track of responsibilities that had gradually accumulated over time. At first, those responsibilities had started small, usually in moments when someone needed temporary help. Over the years, though, they had quietly expanded into something much larger than anyone outside that folder probably realized. The first account I opened was the car insurance policy connected to my father's vehicle. A few years earlier, he had been involved in an accident that caused his insurance premiums to skyrocket. At the time, he had mentioned that the cost was becoming difficult to manage, and without thinking too much about it, I had agreed to co-sign the policy using my credit card so the payments would be more manageable. What was originally described as a short-term arrangement had quietly continued month after month until it became routine. I logged into the insurance portal and scrolled through the payment details, reading each line slowly, even though I already knew exactly what they said. The monthly charge had been leaving my account automatically for a long time. With a few taps on the screen, I removed my credit card from the policy and confirmed the change. The system processed it immediately, replacing my payment method with nothing. The next account on the list was the electricity bill for the house. That situation had started during what my father once described as a temporary rough patch when finances were tight. I had offered to help cover the utilities until things stabilized again. Somehow that temporary arrangement stretched across more than a year without anyone ever formally discussing when it might end. The automatic payment still existed inside the billing system exactly the way I had set it up. I signed into the utility account and navigated to the payment settings, where my card information was listed as the primary billing method. Removing it took less than a minute. The moment the confirmation message appeared on the screen, the quiet finality of the action settled into my chest. The largest responsibility in that folder was connected to the heating and cooling system installed in the house the previous summer. During an intense heat wave, the old HVAC system had failed completely, leaving the house nearly unbearable in the middle of July. When the replacement estimate came in at $9,800, my father had struggled to qualify for financing on his own. I had stepped in as the guarantor so the installation could move forward quickly. I opened a financing account and reviewed the details carefully. Some obligations could not be erased instantly, but I navigated through every option available and removed myself wherever the system allowed it. The guarantor status was adjusted, payment methods were disconnected, and any subscriptions tied to my accounts were canceled one by one. Each change took only seconds to complete, yet together they represented years of quiet support that had existed almost invisibly in the background of my life. When the final account was updated, I sat in the driver's seat looking at the list inside the shared expenses folder. For a long moment, I simply stared at the screen, absorbing the strange feeling that came with watching those connections disappear. Then I opened my email. I attached screenshots showing the changes I had just made across the various accounts, so there would be no confusion later. Each image documented the removed payment methods, canceled automatic transfers, and updated responsibilities that no longer included my name. When the attachments were ready, I typed a single sentence in the subject line. Since I'm only a guest, I'm stepping back from everything I've been covering. I didn't add any explanation in the body of the email. The subject line said everything that needed to be said. After sending it, I placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and finally started the car. As I backed out of the driveway, I caught a brief glimpse of the backyard through the open gate, where people were still gathered around the tables, eating and talking under the decorations I had helped set up earlier that morning. I drove away from the house without looking back. About 5 minutes later, my phone began vibrating against the seat. The screen lit up with the first incoming call, followed by another one almost immediately after it ended. Then a third. Then messages started appearing one after another as the phone continued to buzz. I didn't pick it up. The road ahead was clear, and for the first time that entire day, my mind felt strangely quiet as I continued driving home while the phone kept ringing beside me. About a week passed after that phone call with my father, and during those days I kept my life deliberately quiet. I went to work, came home to my apartment in Grandview Heights, and tried to let the noise from the situation settle in the background without constantly thinking about it. The messages from my family slowed down after the first couple of days, although a few still appeared occasionally on my phone. Most of them were short attempts to reopen the conversation, but I didn't feel any urgency to respond. For the first time in years, I had stepped away from a role that had quietly consumed a lot of my energy, and the silence that followed felt unfamiliar, but strangely steady. One evening near the end of that week, I heard a knock on the door of my apartment. I wasn't expecting anyone, so for a moment, I simply stood still in the living room, listening to the sound echo through the small hallway. When the knock came again, slower this time, I walked over and opened the door. Ethan was standing there. He looked different from the way I remembered him at the Easter gathering only days earlier. His posture was slightly tense, and there was a nervous energy in the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other while waiting for me to say something. For a second, neither of us spoke, the quiet hallway of the apartment building filling the space between us. I stepped aside and let him come in. He walked into the living room slowly, glancing around the apartment as if trying to gather his thoughts before saying anything. When he finally turned toward me, the usual casual confidence he carried in social situations wasn't there. Instead, his expression looked uneasy, like someone preparing to admit something uncomfortable. He started by saying he had come alone and that no one else in the family knew he was there. The words came out slowly, and I could tell he was carefully choosing what to say next. After a moment, he admitted something that surprised me more than I expected. He said that until everything collapsed after the Easter gathering, he genuinely had no idea how much I'd been doing for the family behind the scenes. For years, he had simply assumed that things around the house worked, because they always had. The electricity was on, the internet worked, repairs were handled, and when something went wrong, it usually got fixed without turning into a major crisis. He told me that he never really stopped to question why those things happened so smoothly. From his perspective, it had just been the normal rhythm of the household. Once I stepped away from all of it, that rhythm disappeared almost immediately. He explained that the house had fallen into chaos during the week that followed. The electricity issue caused arguments about overdue bills. The internet outage turned into a frustrating scramble to figure out what equipment was missing, and the insurance situation created a series of stressful phone calls none of them had expected to deal with. According to Ethan, the tension between Melissa and our father had grown worse with each new problem that surfaced, and every conversation seemed to circle back to the same realization that none of them had been paying attention to how much I had quietly been supporting. Hearing him describe it felt strange, not because I was surprised by the consequences, but because for the first time someone in the family was openly acknowledging what had been invisible for so long. Eventually, Ethan looked directly at me and said something even more difficult. He told me he had taken me for granted. The sentence came out without hesitation, and there was no attempt to soften it or shift the responsibility somewhere else. He said that growing up, he had simply gotten used to the idea that I would fix things when they broke or step in when something needed to be handled. From his perspective as the younger brother, it had always felt natural to assume that I would somehow keep everything together. He apologized, and the tone in his voice made it clear that the words weren't being offered as a quick solution to repair everything instantly. He wasn't demanding forgiveness or trying to convince me that the situation should simply return to normal. Instead, he explained that he understood why I had finally walked away and that he couldn't pretend it hadn't been building for years. After saying all of that, he told me the real reason he had come over. He said he didn't want our relationship as brothers to disappear along with the conflict surrounding the rest of the family. The problems between our father and Melissa were complicated and probably wouldn't resolve quickly, but he hoped that maybe we could start rebuilding something separate from all of that. Not the old dynamic where I carried responsibilities for everyone, but simply a relationship between two brothers who had grown up in the same house and shared the same memories. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I gestured toward the kitchen, and we both sat down at the small table near the window. The room was quiet except for the faint sound of traffic outside, and for a while we simply talked without rushing through the conversation. I didn't forgive everything instantly, because years of imbalance don't disappear in a single evening. But I appreciated the honesty in the way Ethan spoke, especially the fact that he wasn't trying to erase what had happened. Over the next couple of hours, we talked about things we hadn't discussed in years. We remembered what the house used to feel like before our mother died, when family gatherings actually felt relaxed instead of tense. We talked about how everything shifted after that loss, and how quickly the roles inside the household changed without anyone clearly acknowledging it. Ethan admitted that when he was younger, he had relied heavily on me without realizing the pressure that created, and I explained how responsibility had slowly turned into expectation over time. At different moments, the conversation drifted toward old memories from childhood, small stories that reminded us of what our relationship had been like long before the complicated dynamics of adulthood settled over the family. Those memories didn't erase what had happened recently, but they created a quiet reminder that our connection as brothers had existed long before everything else became tangled in conflict. By the time we finished talking, nearly 2 hours had passed, and the apartment had grown darker as evening settled outside the window. The conversation hadn't magically repaired everything, but for the first time since the Easter gathering, I felt like at least one part of my family was trying to move forward with honesty instead of pretending nothing had ever been wrong. The months after that conversation with Ethan passed in a way that felt calmer than anything I had experienced in a long time. I focused on my own routine without the constant background awareness that something in my family's household might suddenly require my attention. My days became simple in a way they had not been for years. I went to work, came home to my apartment in Grandview Heights, cooked dinner when I felt like it, and spent quiet evenings reading or watching something without my phone constantly buzzing with requests, updates, or small emergencies that needed to be solved. The distance between me and my father's house remained steady during that time. I didn't receive many calls from him anymore, and Melissa never contacted me at all. The silence from that side of the family didn't feel hostile so much as distant, like two worlds that had slowly drifted apart once the constant thread of responsibility tying them together had been cut. Ethan and I spoke occasionally, sometimes just exchanging short messages or meeting for coffee. Those conversations stayed separate from whatever was happening back at the house. We talked about work, about random memories from childhood, and about the strange feeling of growing older and realizing how complicated families can become when expectations pile up without anyone openly discussing them. One evening, several months later, Ethan called me again. His voice sounded different from the relaxed tone our recent conversations had settled into. There was a hesitation in the way he spoke, the kind people have when they are about to deliver news they know will land heavily. He told me that things at the house had gotten worse than anyone expected. Without the financial support I had quietly provided for so long, the fragile balance that had been holding everything together began falling apart piece by piece. Bills that had once been managed automatically started surfacing as overdue notices. The HVAC system installed during that summer heat wave had financing payments attached to it that my father struggled to keep up with once I removed myself as guarantor. Small problems that once would have been absorbed quietly by my involvement were now landing directly on the household with no buffer. According to Ethan, The tension between my father and Melissa grew sharper with each passing week as more financial issues appeared. At first, they blamed each other for mismanaging the bills. Then the arguments shifted toward the broader reality that they had both relied on a system neither of them fully understood. When that system disappeared, everything else followed. Eventually, the situation reached a breaking point. Ethan told me that Melissa had discovered the full extent of the unpaid HVAC debt, along with several other overdue financial obligations connected to the house. The argument that followed was loud enough that neighbors noticed. Within days, she had told my father to leave the house until the financial situation could be sorted out. What had once looked like a stable suburban marriage began collapsing under the weight of blame, stress, and problems that had been quietly delayed for years. Listening to Ethan describe it felt strangely distant, like hearing about events happening in a place I used to know well, but no longer lived inside. I didn't feel satisfaction or anger while hearing the story. Instead, there was a quiet recognition that the system holding the household together had never really been stable to begin with. A couple of weeks after that phone call, I received something unexpected in the mail. Among the usual stack of advertisements and envelopes was a plain letter addressed to me in handwriting I recognized immediately. My father had always written in a careful, slightly uneven script that made every letter look deliberate. I stood in the kitchen holding the envelope for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The letter wasn't long, but the words were written slowly and with more honesty than I had heard from him in a long time. He admitted that over the years he had relied heavily on me to handle things that he should have taken responsibility for himself. He wrote that when problems appeared in the household, he had grown used to the idea that I would somehow step in and stabilize the situation. The letter acknowledged that he had never properly recognized the weight of that role or expressed appreciation for the way I had carried it. Reading those sentences felt strange because they were simple statements of truth that had taken years to surface. He wrote that the situation at the house had forced him to confront how much of their stability had quietly depended on my involvement. He admitted that losing that support had revealed problems he had ignored for far too long. The final lines of the letter were not dramatic or emotional. They simply said that he understood why I had stepped away and that he was sorry for the way he had spoken to me during the Easter gathering. When I finished reading, I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. I didn't rush to respond. Instead, I placed it in a drawer with other personal documents and went about the rest of my evening. The apology existed there in writing, and that was enough for the moment. Reconciliation was not something that needed to happen quickly or under pressure. Years of imbalance could not be repaired with a single letter, no matter how sincere it might be. What mattered more to me was the quiet shift that had taken place inside my own life. The most important realization from everything that had happened wasn't the idea that I had taken revenge or caused the family's problems to surface. The truth was much simpler than that. For years, I had been the person quietly holding pieces of that household together without anyone truly acknowledging it. The moment I stopped fixing everything, the structure underneath was finally exposed for what it really was. And once that happened, I understood something that had been missing from my life for a very long time. For the first time since I was a teenager trying to keep things together after my mother died, I no longer felt responsible for holding an entire family in place.